So I'm going to jump straight to this slide because it's got a lot of sort of words on it. I was told that the slides will be shared with everybody who attends. So I wanted to put a few things like this in here just as little knowledge notes for you to come back to. I wanted to provide a little bit more context about who I am and a bit of information. So I'm just going to share kind of like a little 2 minutes on how I come to this work and where my knowledge has been gleaned from over the years. So as Joshua mentioned, I have this company, DeathCare BC, and I have many, many years of working with bereaved folks. And that experience is from my work as a funeral director. So I am a licensed funeral director and embalmer in BC. I don't currently work in a funeral home because I am dedicating my efforts to this knowledge project that I'm on. Prior to becoming a funeral director, I did my bachelor's degree in psychology and I was a volunteer with victim services with the RCMP. And that is where I discovered this gap that exists between our public systems and the private systems of death. So what this slide is meant to help illustrate is that with this particular group around palliative care, people who work in end-of-life services, there's high exposure to a particular type of loss. My experience is sort of with the broad spectrum because we don't really discriminate at the funeral home. You get the phone call regardless who it's about. So during my undergrad, in that volunteering job, I'll just tell a very short story because it illustrates where the gap is identified. So with victim services, you attend when there's been a death and it was most of the time unexpected, and you're there to support survivors who are either at a scene or who are being notified of a death. So one of the first death calls I went on was a notification of death for next of kin, and I'm in Kamloops. I'm in the Tk'emlúps nations on the Secwepemcúl'ecw lands. And at that time, I was in Kamloops. And so I showed up, I was 21 years old, showed up with a veteran volunteer with me and the two police officers who were tasked with informing a family that somebody had died. And we got there, and the police officer, the main one that was meant to do the delivering, didn't seem that much older than me and seemed super nervous. And so we knocked on the family's door and we went into their living room, and it was a small living room and it was a Saturday night. And when the police and victim services are in your living room, you know it's probably not great. But it took almost what felt like 10 years, but probably about a minute before the police officer was able to speak. And the words he chose were, we were at this woman's house, her brother had died. The words he chose were, "Your brother is no longer on this planet." And the confusion in the moment after the delivery was like palpable in the room. And for me, as a sort of rookie volunteer, I didn't really know what to do. But the veteran volunteer swooped in, said, "Your brother has died. Here is the phone numbers for the different funeral homes in town," in a nutshell. And that's where I discovered that our death processes are generally to say, "Here's the number for the funeral home. This is who you need to talk to." And I didn't realize that we didn't have a ministry of death. Did People think that as a public healthcare system, a public system that looks after our bodies, that somehow that carries through, but it doesn't. There is an entirely privatized death system that takes over after a death has happened. And I know a lot of the folks in this room will likely know that. But I just think it's so important that what I have found over the years when I'm talking to people who work in care facilities or hospice or hospitals, and I ask them, what are the conversations that you're having with people's families when they're sick or dying? What type of preparations are you doing with them before they have to make the call to the funeral home? And the reality is that for most places, their operating procedure when it comes to that transition of care is to have a list of funeral homes in town, a list of phone numbers, maybe an idea of a range of prices, and then they send the family off to make those phone calls. the reason I really know that that's true is because since 2016, I've been answering these calls from families uh, at 24 hours a day. I'll answer them at 2 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, 10 p.m. at night. And you can just tell from the questions that they're asking that they have no idea what they're doing. And for me, it's been an eye-opening, always an eye-opening process that people can go through years of illness, years of decline, years of all kinds of, very sorry, uh, all kinds of conversations. People can, in the province of BC, can go through the entire MAID process and have an assisted death without having chosen a funeral home. And that's the person that you're going to be working with from that point on. So these unexpected and expected, the expected with no plan, I consider someone who has gone through the entire dying process, but their next of kin doesn't know which funeral home they're going with. I consider that dying without a plan. It is setting a family up to make a lot of really big, expensive decisions when they are not in a state of mind to do so. So part of the mission that I'm on with DeathCare BC is to help drive that point home for care providers so that they start to resource themselves and their organizations with the tools to start supporting families earlier on in the process. So I'll go here. So this is what I'm talking about. What happens when someone dies? Um, I adapted this slide from another presentation I did a few months ago. I usually frame it as the first 2 hours, the first 2 days, and the first 2 weeks, because there's a lot of things that have to happen in a short period of time, and a lot of learning that often has to happen in a very short period of time. And that's kind of the timelines that we're on. So the first call, what that means for anyone who hasn't worked in or around a funeral home, what the first call is that phone call to the funeral home once the family has made a decision. Often there's multiple phone calls because, like I said, even after a long period of illness or a long life, sometimes people haven't even talked, thought, or even imagined the fact that they would be talking to a funeral director. So they'll call, they'll ask for prices, then they'll call back the next day, and then they'll call, every other funeral home. They'll do all the legwork to try and get as much information they can to try and make an informed decision. But it is so tremendously challenging, and I can't tell you how challenging it is as a provider to want to be providing informed and consenting care, but to be under those conditions. I know how therapeutic, very well done death support can be. It is really difficult to do it when you're in a bit of a manufactured crisis with folks. So the more information they have, the earlier, the better. But in that first call, the funeral home is going to ask you, who is the legal next of kin? And in BC, that can mean basically two things. It's either a person designated in the will, so the executor, or it is the legal next of kin based on the order of priority in British Columbia. So that's in the control of disposition, and disposition in this case refers to burial or cremation. So in BC, first person would be the spouse if we're talking about an adult, and then it would be adult children, adult grandchildren, parents, siblings, adult nieces and nephews. That's kind of the order. An interesting thing about BC, kin-like relationships, friendships, do not have a legal position when it comes to disposition. So if you are someone with chosen family, which is something that you hear a lot about, you need to put that chosen family into a legal document and make them a representative, because before your chosen family has an opportunity to provide care for your body, it will go through the public guardian and trustee. So if the public guardian and trustee looks at everything and goes, you know what, this person has under, I believe it's $30,000 in assets, then it goes to the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. And then that is who is making arrangements and care for the dead. I get that question a lot because we do have a crisis, a mental health crisis, a crisis for those who are unhoused. Um, I get a lot of questions about what happens when someone doesn't have any next of kin, and that's what happens. It goes to the public guardian and then it goes to the ministry, and they'll be most likely buried in a designated city cemetery. Um, but that point is really important. The funeral home will ask that question because by law they cannot take instruction from anybody besides that person who's designated, either in a will or in the legal documents. Um, how long is needed before pickup? So again, an interesting anecdote for British Columbia, you're actually not legally required to use a funeral home. So if any of you are intrepid DIYers, it is possible to do all of this on a community level without the support of a funeral director. There are certain things that must be done by a licensed person. For example, embalming. Uh, but that seems pretty obvious. I don't think that there's very many sort of backyard embalmers happening out there. But if you wanted to, you can get the permits to drive somebody yourself. You can build your own casket. You can arrange your own burial to occur. And you can do all of that. And you can even do death registration. So you can request the medical documents. You can register with vital statistics all yourself. We live in a big, wide province where there are a lot of rural areas with challenges being served, and there are community groups who step in and do that work. So when I say how long is needed before pickup, that might mean that a family has decided to bathe and dress their own person. They might have decided to have a multi-day vigil, or they might not even want me to pick them up. They might say, don't worry about it. We'll drive them ourselves. We have a Dodge Caravan and we're going to look after it. Most of the time, they'll say, how soon can you come? And I'll say, get here ASAP, because they're kind of freaked out. But what I usually tell people is to, though their body is telling them it's urgent, to try and maybe take a breath and take a little bit of time, even if they don't think that they need it in the moment. But we take direction from them. And a third question that they will ask, or I mean, there's probably about 4 dozen questions they'll ask, but is a pre-plan in place? So again, in anywhere in Canada, actually, you can prepay your funeral. So I bought and paid for my funeral when I was 28 to make a point, and because I was earning good money at the time. But I have already paid for my casket, my 2 death certificates, a seasonal bouquet of flowers. It's all held by an insurance company, and it can be applied at any of the funeral homes in my neighborhood. So I did that again to make a point that it's a guaranteed thing that's going to happen. The more preparation that you do, the earlier, the better off your grievers will be, the people that you love who are going to be the most impacted. So in the first 2 days, the arrangement meeting. The arrangement meeting is what it's called when you sit down with a funeral home and you do the authorization paperwork. So sometimes it happens in people's homes, sometimes it happens at the office. It can happen virtually. A lot of that happened over COVID. A lot of that changed actually. There are businesses where you can go online. You can submit all of your loved ones' information online. You can receive a DocuSign packet and digitally sign all of it. And they will take care of all the services and then have cremated remains delivered to you if your loved one dies in hospital. Or actually, well, if your loved one dies anywhere, but especially in hospital, it's very straightforward for an expected death, for a plan for an anticipated death. You can essentially order a cremation online in our kind of modern manifestation here. I don't know that I recommend it. And that's not me touting for funeral homes. I think it's because when you look at how disruptive dying is on the function and routine of a family, I think that sometimes these tasks oriented around funeral service or cremation arranging, all of those things, it provides a bit of a buffer between when a death has happened and sort of the rest of grief that occurs after. It provides people things to do, places to be, stuff to talk about. And I think that there's a reason that we've kind of done it this way for as long as we have, and it's because it's meeting a kind of uh, a need that we have to have something to do with all of our energy. So in that arrangement meeting, it might be a couple of hours. You talk about the needs of the bereaved, if they need to see somebody again, if they might want a lock of hair or a fingerprint, if they ever talked about cremation or burial, um, if, when, where, how of a service, um, if they want to see their person's body again before cremation or burial happens. There's a lot of different reasons why people might do that. And I urge folks to be open-minded. Um, I know that just in my experience, anecdotally, with talking to people in the last few years, I can't tell you how many times somebody has gone, just throw me in the ditch, or, put me out back, leave me in the forest, put me, the number of people who come to me and say that with a complete disregard for the significance that their body has to the people that matter to them. It's surprising to me. So I encourage people to sort of take a moment, because a service can look like a lot of different things. I would call a funeral service, if you've got someone's just there and they've got one person who wants to come and see them, that that is meeting a need to me. If you decide to have a full traditional Catholic service with an entombment and a mausoleum, that is obviously also a funeral service. But it might look like a family dinner. It might look like a picnic. You don't know, but you have to kind of sit down and talk about it. And finally, it's the care of their person's body. That's one of the big things that we talk about in an arrangement. And so when you think about kind of what's happened so far, if we're on day 3, is that kind of urgent phone call, decision making, shopping, price checking. And then now they're sitting down with the funeral director. They're suddenly being asked whether or not they want to give shoes to their person before they're cremated. And I have to tell you, sometimes these questions just boggle folks. They don't know whether to leave rings with someone or not leave rings, or do you want to write them a note? Do you not want to write them a note? Um, did they want their nails painted? It's, they're obscure things, but if we don't talk about it, we don't know whether or not the person is consented to or against anything. And so the level of sort of delicate informing that has to happen in these arrangements is huge. And so finally, once all those decisions are made and the paperwork is signed, you've got disposition. So in BC, we have 2 options for disposition. It is burial or flame cremation. In I think 6 other provinces now, we've got water cremation as well. That's alkaline hydrolysis. It's not available in BC yet because we're just a little slow to the punch, or maybe just a little bit of apathy from legislators not to drive it. And we don't have natural organic reduction, which is human composting, which is available in Washington. That being said, if someone dies in BC and it was their wish to go through a composting process and to become a cubic yard of soil, they can work with a funeral home to be transported to the US to have that done and then have the dirt returned. And multiple people have done that now. There's a couple of funeral homes in Vancouver who have made that one of their service offerings. So for alkaline hydrolysis, you could go to Saskatchewan. It's legal in Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, the Yukon, Northwest Territories. It's just not in BC yet. Water cremation is about 90% more energy efficient than flame, and it has a fraction of the emissions related to it. So flame cremation is pretty fossil fuel heavy, as you can imagine. So it's pretty straightforward. We've got those 2 options. Green burial is kind of what it sounds like. It's direct earth burial. It's what I want when I die. It's the thing I've pre-planned for and paid for, is my plain pine casket without varnish on it. But it's not necessarily available everywhere. So if eco-friendly values are something you live by and something that you would also like to die by, consider looking up in your community what's available and maybe start sort of advocating with your municipality if they don't have green burial on the menu, as it were. That's what I'm doing in my hometown anyhow. So this slide, again, I went a lot more writing heavy than usual just because all these slides are going to be shared with you after. So you can have these with you as a reference. I think what I'm trying to get at with sharing the level of information that I have about what a funeral home does is to just really emphasize what it's important to convey to a family before a death has happened. And I know that this group, more than pretty much anybody else that I've probably talked to, knows the challenges around the conversations that you're having, the challenges in bringing up, the fact that someone's dying. I think probably here everyone's a lot more comfortable with it than some, but some people don't even want to talk about the fact that death happens. Um, their family don't want to talk about the fact that their person will die eventually. um, it is a disservice to them not to find a way to have those conversations happen in one form or another. And the reason I put it that way is because it is inevitable and it is essential that they make these decisions at some point. And waiting until after the person has died and the shock, the grief of early bereavement, and then all of a sudden the bureaucracy and cost of death, it creates a really compounding and traumatic situation for people. Um, the funeral industry has a really, I think, kind of a complicated public image. And I think part of the reason that that complicated public image is what it is because that's the state of mind that people go into those arrangements with a lot of the time. So it's not surprising that 6 months later, somebody might look back and go, why did I pay $3,000 for a casket? Or why did we cremate that necklace? I wanted to give it to my daughter. Or why any number of things. And the answer typically is that you were under pressure in what felt like an unexpected situation, and you had to make a decision. And so when I sit with families and I feel really grateful that people call me now. I was saying to Joshua before we got on that it feels so good to be at a point now where people call me when someone is dying or when someone has died. And that might sound a little dark that I'm smiling about that, but it's such a relief to know that to feel for myself that I'm available to give people information when they need it. Because that's what the funeral homes have to do. It's part of the call. And when we can do it with an informed consumer, the whole thing feels so much better. It feels ethical. It feels in service to the family. Um, but as much as I tell people all the time, just call your local funeral home or go in there, go introduce yourself to them. People don't take me up on it, and I'm not sure why. So they're just normal people. They're normal people who are in service on the other side of the same coin that you are. And there's a lot probably that you've got in common. So I just have this slide here to talk about what the funeral home does. Um, One of the things, and I'm gonna just pop to this slide right now. One of my hopes is that by conveying the importance of preparing for death ahead of time, is that we can raise the standard of care that people are receiving in non or in unexpected situations. So if we are unable to adequately prepare people to go into the funeral home when they are having a long decline and anticipated death, as I mentioned, how can we hope to support people with unexpected deaths in community? And this is an especially important point to me. The two of my main areas of passion, just by circumstance when I entered funeral service, are unexpected deaths due to drug toxicity. And also another area of where there's been underservice is in perinatal loss. These are unfortunately um, becoming and things that we can anticipate. If someone is living with addiction in 2024, and they are living in addiction in our current supply environment, then there are conversations that we should be having earlier with their families to help them understand what can happen or what could happen. Um, I have worked with these families now more than I care to count in walking them through these conversations and decisions after a loss. And so I think it's one of the amazing opportunities that we've got is to invite folks into this conversation with their elders and making it a way that we can intergenerationally change our narratives around preparing for a loss. One that includes this post-loss period of time, so that for these other situations, we feel like we are somewhat equipped. So that is one of the things that I hope sort of carries through from these types of conversations. Um, what is on this slide is a web that I have done. I actually designed it's a game, but it's not a fun game. It's more of a decision tree. So I have it, I've got a link I can share to it. But it's basically, it's a choose your own adventure is kind of how I framed it. And in doing that, I spent more time than I want to count, going through and saying, what are the different options that people have after a death and what are we trying to navigate them through? And this is what that web looks like. And this is just with our burial and cremation options in BC. It's got things like attending at the crematorium to witness the cremation, uh, things like bringing someone's body home, bathing or dressing them yourself, not having a service, but maybe attending at placing a niche or something like that, scattering ashes, all of these options that exist for people. I tried to walk through all of them and provide information. But this network is just to help emphasize that it's really complicated and it can feel very complicated for us. And we're sitting here together in a pretty neutral state of mind, hopefully, not in the midst of a serious loss, but just try and imagine what it is for someone who is in a crisis, who's thinking about all of these decisions and trying to make them. So I'm gonna go back because, oopsie daisies, I'm gonna go forward and then I'm gonna go back. Um, because these were the learning objectives that I started with. And I wanted to leave kind of ample time for questions, and maybe it's too ample, Joshua, you can tell me because I can share more. But I wanted to do that because I find the questions that come from an informed group, and this is a highly informed group, um, are sometimes much richer than I can guess that you might ask. So I wanted to leave it there, and I see Gally has already shared two questions. So I can leave this or maybe I'll just Joshua, if you want to tell me what the best way of doing this is. I promise that the questions will provide some further clarity where it's needed because you get to dictate that. So yeah.
So thank you so much for the presentation. I've learned a lot, and I know people probably have a ton of different questions. So it's really up to you on what you want to do. If you want to, we can just read from the chat. We can actually also just stop sharing and then have people sort of also state their questions to you. It's really up to you.
That works for me because my mouse isn't working very well, so I'm really worried that I'm gonna like accidentally close something. So I'm just
Okay.
gonna close that for now. And if you want to put the questions in the chat, I can run through them. So from Gally, her first question was for clients who are dying and don't want to talk to a funeral home and don't have family who can do it for them, can a friend or a clinician with the client providing consent only? So I would be really clear on the do not have family point first. Uh, being estranged is not the same as not having family. And when the funeral home gets the call, the public guardian and trustee doesn't want to take those calls. If they can find any distant relative or cousin, that person is going to be responsible. So be really, really clear on what it means to not have family. Um, the clinician can make the calls. I've had that before. As I mentioned, people can go through the entire MAID process and not have a will in place, not have a funeral home picked out. And I can tell you what happens if someone doesn't have a will and they don't have next of kin. I've worked with folks before where they've sat in the morgue for 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks, waiting for the government, for public guardian or for ministry to figure out who's going to make these arrangements because it's essentially hot potato. Nobody wants to be responsible for it. And in the meantime, if you're someone like myself or most people who work in funeral service, those bodies matter. And the idea, the indignity of them waiting in the morgue for decisions to be made, it's harsh. It feels wrong, but that's how it is. So yeah, the clinician can call a funeral home and request a transfer happen. Funeral home might be reticent to transfer somebody who doesn't have any representation, but they will likely do it. But a friend or clinician can't obviously make arrangements unless they're in the will. And I see Gali, you've raised your hand. Or maybe. I think you're unmuted if you wanted to, you could speak, but I will, information is imperative. Can I share the web? Yes, I will share the web and I will also share the, I can't hear you, Gali, unfortunately. I will share the game. It's the DeathCare Decisions game. I can actually probably just put it in the chat right now. Because the web is from a coding platform, it's a little bit complex. Yeah, Gali, unfortunately, we can't hear you, so you might have to put it in the chat if you've got a question. And in the meantime, Valerie.
Oh, thank you for adding the French. I am not
Yeah.
French. Appreciate your beautiful accent.
Mhm.
I'm a hospice palliative care nurse practitioner in Kingston, Ontario, and like you, I'm a bit of a death dweeb. I have many death-themed tattoos. I've Ars Moriendi on my wrist and have already done all my funeral pre-planning. I did it during COVID, and my husband was working at the dining room table, and I asked him, I had a headset on talking to the funeral insurance company planner and said, "Is it okay if I just put you in a sack in the ground? That's what I'm doing when I die." He was like, "Sorry, who are you talking to?"
Yeah.
So in our house, we have a pretty good understanding of what plans are and what dying is and
Mhm.
what death is. I just did a talk yesterday with a group of nursing students who are doing some work in increasing competency in undergrad nursing in being with and communicating with family when a patient dies. And one of the points I made to them was, you know, this idea of expected versus unexpected death and how in our society we often quantify or qualify deaths as unexpected when in reality it was quite expected.
Mhm.
You know, this decline that has happened over the last 18 months where mom hasn't been able to do the things she used to be able to do, and she's been in the hospital 3 times and she's on more medication and she needs more support at home. That's not an unexpected death, right?
Yeah.
Sure, we didn't know it was going to happen today, but we've had clues and, you know, things that could have, should have ideally prompted the healthcare team and the people caring for this person to have these types of conversations. And I think it's a reflection of our death denying society and the fact that we don't want to talk about the fact that this is going to happen to everybody. And yet when you frame it the way you have, that what you're doing is giving a gift to the people who are left behind by not having to take on this decision making and this stress, when really what they should be allowed to and able to do is be sad and grieve and feel the feelings that come up. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the messaging that I think probably everybody on this call is trying to do in their small little spaces. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I think it's just I wanted to sort of circle back on a point that I made a little bit more quickly, but it's about sort of the intergenerational experiences of death and dying. And when I work with families where you've got sort of the middle, the sandwich person who's dealing with a dying parent, or dealing with, but having a parent who's ill or ailing and also has children or maybe, grandchildren. We're living for such a long time that sometimes folks are getting to their 70s before they're ever having to talk to a funeral home, which isn't how it always was. It's a kind of a new thing. That seeing it as an opportunity for a family to experience a natural order death, and process that in a way that is a little bit different. When I talk to people and they're like, well, what about my kids? Do I include them in the funeral? Do I bring them? Or what am I supposed to do with these grandkids who are grieving and heartbroken? And I just see it that way, that when a grandparent dies, it's a gift for the grandchildren to experience this particular type of anticipated loss, because you have no guarantee that they won't experience the loss of an aunt or uncle, or of a pregnancy, if their mom experiences loss of a pregnancy, which is something that happens again, is everywhere but also nowhere. That you can teach and learn along with your kids what early bereavement looks like. And it's just so much, there's so much richness and learning that can happen that we are unable to really experience if we feel like we are fighting a fire. Um, and so the only way that I have seen it properly mitigated in the past is when I've worked with people who really did have just a whole pile of conversation ahead of time. And I'm talking like even with the unimaginable things. I helped a family very recently with an extremely tragic loss of a very young person. And they were talking about how they had had conversations around the dinner table about what they wanted as parents. Like I told them I wanted cremation. You know what they said? I want the same thing. And I never imagined I would be making their arrangements, but here we are. And so just that those small conversations can provide a North Star. And as practitioners, I see it as, part of it. Just it has to be a part of the practice if we're wanting to set up people in their early bereavement on a grief trajectory in the correct direction. The way I look at it is, if I do my job as a funeral director extremely well, someone's trajectory in their healing might be altered. Um, there's a good chance that even if someone has a really, really difficult time early, they'll still end up in that kind of that healed place eventually, or a healing place eventually. But if we do our jobs really, really well, we can put them in a direction where they're getting there sooner. And at the very least, not sort of setting them back, and starting them further back. So I often talk about the transition from patient-centered care to family-centered care, and that often that transition happens at the moment of death. And I see the next of kin and bereaved folks as they're my clients. And the dead. I really genuinely care for the dead. I think that they're important and we have so much to learn from them. And I see it as a tremendous honor and a privilege to be the last person that bathes or talks to or sees the face of beloved people. I think it's very important. Um, but our bereaved folks, I think we could be doing a little bit better by them, with the right types of, honestly, the right types of standard operating procedures, moving beyond the list of phone numbers of local funeral providers and taking it to the next level of not just those phone numbers, but also having them connected with them ahead of time, or at minimum having them fill out some type of paperwork or questions or documents or whatnot. Um, yeah, so I think, Yali, this was a direct message, so I'm not going to read it out loud just in case. Right. So you mentioned that in your work, you require that clients have a funeral home sorted before providing service. we do not have information about the family and the client, and neither or refuses to discuss. It is very common, like in long-term care, for example, often as part of the admission or the onboarding of a new resident, you have to write down which funeral home you would use in case of death. Same with hospice, you usually have to pick a funeral home. That does not mean that any thought beyond that has been dedicated to it. Sometimes it just means someone went on to Google and said closest funeral home, and then they just put that in there. It sometimes doesn't really mean a whole lot. All it means it's a bit of a CYA for that that institution. So I think it is good to have a name of a funeral home and a phone number, but we could go a few steps further beyond that. Sandra says, in healthcare, we ask about advanced healthcare directives all the time and ask if people have POA documents in place. We definitely don't ask if people have pre-planned their death arrangements. Yeah, I think it's not, in my experience over the last 8 years, it hasn't been a common thing. You can pre-plan all of the details. It doesn't mean you have to pay in advance. If you pay in advance, it's just an extra sort of bonus for your family because they're not having to also pull out their wallets and make the decision of, oh, well, the cardboard casket is about $300 cheaper than the particle board or balsa wood that exists. If you take all those decisions out of it, I can hardly express what a difference it makes. Tammy says, thank you for not talking about the what's, but emulating the how, which is apparent. Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind. Yeah, I myself, it's a really interesting, my parents are both alive. My grandparents died before before I'd really come online as a human being. I think I was 16 when my grandmother died. So I haven't actually experienced that first person experience of parent loss yet. And I usually tell people I feel like I'm in a bit of a twilight of my career in that sense. But at this stage, we are experiencing a lot more decline in my broader community. And part of the reason I feel a bit urgent about getting this message across is that for folks who were born between 45 and 65, we are going to be entering a phenomena that you have experienced your entire lives, which is when you were children, it was difficult to find childcare. When you were in elementary school, it was difficult to find teachers in buildings. When you went to university, it was hard to get in. When you got jobs, it was hard to find jobs. When you die, unfortunately, it's going to be a large amount of pressure on the system. And again, the funeral home system, the death system is entirely privatized. The government, the only morgues that the government maintains are the ones in the hospital. All the community morgues are private businesses. All the transfer services that move dead bodies, those are all private businesses. We're relying really heavily on this private industry infrastructure. And when there's a large pressure bottleneck, it's going to be really hard for people like me to sit down and do tender care because I've already worked at a funeral home where we were serving 100 families a month. I was managing a funeral home through that first year of COVID, where we had between 80 and 100 family calls a month. There's not enough time to do all of the things that we would ideally want to do if we had all the time in the world. So part of this is also just saying that and I know it's the exact same for the healthcare system, nobody has time. But it's just the more we can kind of disperse some of these conversations, the better off we will all be. Valerie says, in home care, we have a document the care coordinators start when someone is identified as life limiting. So hopefully early on in the diagnosis, one of the questions at that time is, have they completed funeral planning? We also have the expected death in the home checklist that requires a funeral home to be included. So there's a process in place for time of death. Although not perfect, it's better than nothing. Absolutely. So if anyone wants to talk to me about operating procedures, it's my other background is in logistics. And I think that that's partially where I come to this from. I think that it's the questions that you don't know to ask. MAID has been actually a really awesome kind of development in some ways because I'll get calls from people in advance that we never would have kind of had before. But like what a really there's so many quirky ones that come up for MAID. But it's the things that you wouldn't think to ask if you don't kind of know about the system. So I'll use one example because this woman was really amazing. A woman with ALS was dying, and her husband and her came in and were having those conversations ahead of time at the funeral home. So I was the one who met with them, and she had a pacemaker. She was seeking MAID, and she had gone to St. Paul's and said, "Can't you just turn the pacemaker off?" And they said, "No, that's not how we do it. It's not permitted." But it freaked her out that the pacemaker was going to keep going after she had died. It was causing her actually quite a bit of anxiety. So as a funeral director, I knew when you're cremated, your pacemaker has to come out. You can't cremate pacemakers. They will explode in the retort. So I knew that the pacemaker would be coming out. And because I'm an embalmer, I said, would you want me maybe to be one of the people who picks you up after you've died? And I'll just take that thing out right away. I said it'll be gone within the hour. And even though that seems like such a bizarre request, the amount of relief that she got from knowing that it would be out, she teared up, her husband teared up. It was like a weight was off her shoulders. And sure enough, a few weeks later, I went to her home after she had died and was one of the people who lifted her onto the cot and gave her husband a big hug because we knew each other already. And I followed them back and took her pacemaker out right away. And that was something that had to happen anyway. And who would have thought? I never would have thought. And it's not always something as bizarre as that. I've had spouses come in with MAID again who didn't realize that they could keep somebody at home overnight. And that has created opportunities for children to participate in laying out of flowers or playing music or just easing that time of transition. I think the more time folks have insulated in that close family bubble before strangers come in, I think that there's a tremendous amount of healing that happens in that bubble. So another advantage of talking to the funeral home ahead of time is that you're not all of a sudden feeling like you're under some sort of pressure to make a decision. You go, okay, I know they're there when I need them, and I'm just going to be here in this moment. Valerie, I see your hand, and I think we've maybe got like 2 more minutes.
I just wanted to share a quick anecdote in kind of the opposite sense of the ones that you've shared. When I talk with families and patients about pre-planning and what will happen at the time of death, and that it's not an urgent situation, that this is expected and they can take all the time they want, having these conversations up front is really important, because I've had instances where I talk, you could wait for hours and have family come from out of town and see the body, or you could call a funeral home right away, whatever you need as a family, and have the patient say, don't put me on display like that. It's not a museum. I don't want people traipsing through here seeing my body after I've died. And the family looked genuinely shocked. Like they had thought that this is just what they would do. And yet this is exactly what the patient did, what the person did not want. And so when it's a great example of when we make assumptions because we haven't asked the questions, we may in fact be doing something that this individual really didn't want done because we just felt uncomfortable having the conversation.
Yeah, and it's also true often that I mean with all of this stuff, the initial response with a lot of the things that I do generally is like kind of like a no. It's pretty much a no. And then people can come around on a yes once they understand why you might do something. Um yeah, just to tie it back in again, I do a lot of work around perinatal loss and infant care. When I talk about the things that you can do for yourself, like the things you can do on your own, in those circumstances especially, it can be really huge for people to take those responsibilities on for themselves, to be the ones who are transporting or bathing or doing those kinds of things. But absolutely, you're right. The patient's consenting to what occurs with their body is a really interesting question, because when they're not able to speak for themselves anymore, the ideal situation is that the person who's designated has enough information to be able to make those decisions on their behalf, just like with advanced care planning. You would hope that your Section 9 rep or Section 8 rep has the information to make the decision, They don't always, but that's the ideal scenario. And I think we're,
I think
yeah,
we're
yeah.
at time, but thank you so much, Emily. This is so informative, and I do said you have a very compassionate way and of companion people through the process. And I think as we sort of move forward, even if you're a friend of someone going through this, the realize that there's time. Like they don't need to make the decisions right away. I think that was one of the big things that I didn't know going in. I thought like there's a time pressure on making these decisions, but no, you can actually take time to make and get the education you need prior to. So I think if we're helping someone or supporting someone through the grieving process, I think that's a really good point to always sort of keep in mind that these decisions don't have to be right now. Like
Hmm.
that you can sit on them, sleep on them, and weigh them. So
Yeah.
thank you anyways so much for being here and
Mhm.
giving us your time and some of your wisdom. And
Yeah.
so before we end, we always like to do one last poll to sort of see um, basically how much this helped. So if you want to launch that poll, there we go. Is everyone seeing the poll now? Okay, good. Okay, oh, there's a lot. Oh, this is good. This is good news. And that makes me happy, just as someone being a part of this is that's why we do this, is to help inform people and give people more confidence on with the guests we bring in to really inform decisions that they may have to make one day or their friends are going to have to make. Okay, so not all the people from Not at All have went other places, so that's amazing. So good job, Emily. Really appreciate that. And so, if people love these echo sessions, our next one is going to be on the playful art of supporting children with grief using play therapy as a way to communicate. And so that is next month on November 7th at the same time at noon. And there'll be a short survey when you close the Zoom. If you can complete that, that'll be helpful. Other than that, just want to sort of, if you want to be notified more about these talks that we have every month, feel free to subscribe to our newsletter. And our aim is to provide a copy of the presentation recording and then also summary notes within the next 7 working days. So we'll email you that. So thank you again for just being a part of this and wanting to learn more in this area in general. It makes me realize that we are changing and the culture is shifting. So thank you again. And we wish you all the best for the rest of the day.